Good evening and welcome to Economics Unbound. Now tell me, dear viewer, have you heard of cryonomics? Tonight we ask an important question. Can you put a whole economy on ice and then thaw it out a few months later? How do you unfreeze an economy that has been put on ice by a lockdown? As South Africa begins to contemplate stage 3 of the lockdown, with the easing of restrictions on businesses and the economy in general, we ask, what is the best program of recovery that will both bring the outbreak under control, but also assist the economy to bounce back with as little permanent scarring as humanly possible? Hello, Nana, and what's your take?
What cryonomics? Oh, cry me a river. I've come to absolutely hate this talk of the so-called new economy for two reasons. First, I think it is a distraction from dealing with the now and present need to resolve the economic issues of the lockdown, like the need for deeper stimulus measures in the face of the facts of the liquidations, the bankruptcies, and the job losses. And most heartbreaking of all is the HSRC report that indicates that 15 million South Africans cannot afford food, and the hundreds of thousands of food parcels are inadequate for the millions of citizens who need to be food secure. Tans, imagine child poverty effects, the child mortality rate rise, the physical and intellectual development stunting. But hey Tans, let us get on with it and think alongside our government and ask the question that you pose. How does one unfreeze an economy?
I think you meant child mortality rates rising. Oh dear Nana, thanks for allowing us to proceed nevertheless. Now, cryonomics looks at the economics of unfreezing an economy after lockdown. To understand the world better is to understand that it's derived from genetics or biology, and it refers to freezing of genetic material and the unfreezing or the unthawing of the same material a bit later in order for it to be used again. But why this will be so hard to imagine is because an economy is a remarkably complex pattern of relationships. I learned, and I read in fact, that those relationships are not only between employees and big companies or employers, but also between borrowers and lenders, between shareholders and companies, between landlords and tenants, and between producers. And they're all tied together through this commercial mix of relationships. And imagine that there are supply chains and there are bonds between brands and between those who follow those brands. In fact, they are fans.
Global governments and researchers are furiously working on a vaccine, which may take a year or longer to develop. Until a vaccine is available, one of the primary questions that commercial real estate owners and occupiers have to consider is, how quickly can the global economy bounce back? And how long will the impact linger? The International Monetary Fund chief, Kristalina Georgieva, has called it the worst crisis since the Great Depression a century ago and warned the damage could linger. But here's a small package explaining what Stage 3 means in South Africa.
South Africa's first confirmed case of COVID-19 was recorded on the 5th of March, and President Cyril Ramaphosa placed the country under lockdown at level 5 3 weeks later on the 26th March. 6 weeks on, the country has registered 11,350 positive cases, and 206 South Africans have lost their lives due to complications from the virus. However, experts are now saying that the country still has a way to go before infection numbers reach their peak. Ramaphosa lowered the lockdown from level 5 to level 4 on the 1st of May. Food delivery services were allowed to operate, but some restrictions, such as the ban of sale of tobacco, remained. Other measures include the compulsory wearing of face masks and a strict curfew between the hours of 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. Now, many businesses are worried that with no end to the lockdown in sight, the economy is heading for a serious downturn. Some have estimated that the country's GDP could shrink by more than 16%. Minister of Police Bheki Cele has hinted that some restrictions may soon be eased and lockdown downgraded again to level 3. The National Coronavirus Command Council will decide when to lower lockdown to level 3. it would ease restrictions enough to allow people to return to work. According to the guidelines set out by the Department of Health, Level 3 permits all e-commerce services, limited domestic air travel, and the sale of alcohol between 8 a.m. and 12 p.m. on Mondays and Wednesdays. Vehicle sales, commercial construction, and laundry services will be allowed to resume, and industries such as steel, clothing, and chemical manufacturing will be allowed to scale up to 100% capacity. The sale of tobacco will also likely to be permitted. Travel between provinces, except for returning to work or funerals and social gatherings, will however remain prohibited, and a curfew between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. will stay in place. Everyone will also still be required to wear their face masks when leaving their properties and still maintain a 2-meter social distance in public spaces and transport. For Level 3 to be approved, South Africa will first need to see a flattening of the curve of COVID-19 infections, and that might still be a few weeks away. Prudence Makubalo, SABC News, Johannesburg.
TANS, according to reports, British economist Gregory Darko of Oxford Economics is less pessimistic about 2020 and less optimistic about 2021, estimating a 5.9% rebound in the global economy next year. But TANS, the massive stimulus packages across the world, and the general rise in government spending, notwithstanding the economic trauma, will still be visible in the statistics, in the streets, and on household budgets for many months to come.
Busa says it has been calling on government to reopen the economy while also ensuring that people's health is protected. It welcomes the announcement that more sectors will be allowed to operate. The organization says it's concerned about the impact of COVID-19 on the economy and on the livelihoods of many South Africans.
We have indicated to government consistently that we would prefer government opening up the economy and putting into place a short list of exclusions, and also ensuring that conditions are set for businesses to ensure that employees' health is protected and the spread of the coronavirus is limited. We believe that this is far more effective than a gradual opening up of the economy with a long list of permitted items.
The NSBC says Cape Town and Johannesburg have the highest number of COVID-19 cases and are the two dominant areas for small businesses. CEO Mike Anderson says even at level 3, 75% of small businesses still have enormous restrictions on rights. He says the threat to small businesses and the livelihoods because of job losses in this sector and increased poverty is far greater than the threat to lives as a result of anything else.
The latest announcements were too little, too late for small business in general. A continued lockdown with no end in sight is not in the best interests of the small business sector and the economy. Small business need more direction and assurance that they can plan and prepare. Small businesses are the vital engines of our society. A flourishing small business sector is the future of job creation.
Meanwhile, the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, SACI, says trade conditions were badly affected by the strict lockdown regulations. SACI says due to the lockdown, certain businesses have been closing because of fixed overheads, but with a rapidly dwindling income. The organization says the respondents to the trade conditions survey accept a calculated but balanced risk to unlock the economy. Gloria Sefakomosi, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, thanks to Glorious over there. Now, Professor Joseph Stiglitz was speaking at the Institute for New Economic Thinking in New York this afternoon. He is the Nobel Prize winner for economics, I think the year was 2011, and a holder of the prestigious John Bates Clark Medal. Now, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who is the former chief economist of the World Bank and also a former member of the United States President's Council on Economic Advisors, expressed a number of concerns. Firstly, he talked to the issue of a universal basic income grant. Now, we know the Americans got $1,200, and what is the equivalent of our basic income grant, we got around $350. Well, that may be the early beginnings of an income grant. Now, Stiglitz also expressed concerns that the money, all those trillions sloshing through the American economy, could possibly end up on the balance sheets of large corporations and banks instead of in the economy in general and instead of among households. You know, he has received more than 40 honorary degrees, and he was named by Time magazine one of the 100 most influential people. Now, just listen into some of the webinar that we dipped into this afternoon in New York.
Given your point about how badly targeted the money that has gone out already has been, what does this imply for thinking about a UBI for the future? Does this really look like a UBI? Is this telling us that we should be thinking about UBI, or is in fact it telling us that we need to be going in exactly the opposite direction?
Well, the $1,200 payment that we was part of the package is a kind of UBI, not quite universal because there were income limits, but it went to the vast majority of Americans. It was necessary because we recognized we couldn't do a better job of targeting, although the Paycheck Guarantee Program I talked about does actually a much better job than, for instance, the PPP program. But when we recover from the pandemic, there's still one of the reasons I've not been a big fan of UBI is when I look at the world for the next 30 years, I see huge needs. We have to make a green transition. We need huge investments to make that green transition. We have to care for the aged. There are going to be we have inadequacies in our infrastructure, in our education system, in our research. So I think of all the needs that our society has, and so I believe that for the next 30 years, if we can organize ourselves, we should be committed to making sure that everybody who wants a job can get a job. We need to use those labor services. And for most people, work is an important part of their life. So they want to work. So they want to work. We need their efforts. And so rather than UBI, I'd like to move in that direction and fulfill the commitment we made in 1948. We made a commitment in 1948 that we would provide jobs for everybody in the Full Employment Act. So we made the commitment. We unfortunately haven't always honored it. Finally, let me say that the challenge of maintaining full employment is going to be made more difficult by COVID-19. And the reason I say that is that the cost of labor will go up significantly because the organization of labor is going to have to embed social distancing. And as we think of that extra cost and that extra risk, some firms it's going to tilt firms to move into more capital intensive processes. So I think that we are going to see that, for instance, one of the things that has been exposed by COVID-19 is the lack of resilience of our global supply chains. There's going to be some insourcing, but when it comes back into the United States, it'll be done by robots, not by humans. So I think the labor market is going to be facing, to put it euphemistically, challenges in coming years.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I'm going to shift now to some of the questions we have coming in. We have a question here from Jordi Velasco that says, our modern monetary theory recipe is good enough to tackle this particular crisis?
Yeah, let me try to explain the origins of modern monetary theory and why it actually raises the questions that should be a warning. The idea of modern monetary theory was stimulated by the fact that in the 2008 crisis, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet from roughly 800 billion to 4 trillion, and there was no inflation. And so people will say, well, why don't we just print money and that will enable us to finance anything we want? Of course, there's some limit, but clearly we can do a lot more than we've done in the past. The reason that the expansion of the Fed's balance sheet from 800 billion to 4 trillion didn't have an inflationary pressure, consequences was the money just went into banks' balance sheets. It just went into the banks and wasn't lent out. So it didn't work to stimulate the economy. So because it didn't stimulate the economy, it didn't put any inflationary pressure. If the banks had lent the money, then it would have led to an increase in aggregate demand, and an increase in aggregate demand of that magnitude might have been inflationary. Now, we're going through exactly the same thing right now, and I mentioned that very briefly in my talk. I worry that what is going to happen, the $2.7 trillion, much of that is not going to show up, translate into a sustained increase in aggregate demand. A lot of it is going to be held not now just by banks, but by firms who get that money as precautionary balances. They're extremely nervous and they'll just hold on it. Now, some of them will take that money and put it into the stock market, into assets. So we'll see some asset price increases. One of the reasons why the stock market is doing very well is the Fed is putting out money, and some of that money is going to being held in those forms. And because bonds are paying such low interest rates. But it's not going to go into an increase in aggregate demand. So modern monetary theory can't be used for saying, let's use that for financing real investments by government. If you increase government spending in real terms, not in transfer payments, but by building roads, say, by a few $1 trillion, that would start once we get back to normal, not now, but once we get back to normal, that would have could have inflationary pressures.
Measures already announced by President Ramaphosa. Aggressive investment and well-designed policy could bring the economy back more quickly and with less long-term distress for workers, homes and businesses. China has embarked on a recovery plan, and these are the main features of their recovery plan.
Now, Chinese tourists take over 100 million trips for holiday as the coronavirus saw nearly 104 million domestic tourist trips in the first 4 days of the 5-day May Day holiday, which started on May 1 as the novel coronavirus epidemic in the country became more subdued. The domestic tourism generated 43.23 billion yuan, about $6.13 billion in revenue from May 1 to 4, according to the Ministry of Culture and Tourism of China. Now, the Ministry of Culture and Tourism and the National Health Commission recently released a circular requiring tourist sites that resume operations to receive no more than 30% of their daily visitor capacity, and indoor tourist sites should remain closed amid the epidemic. In addition, the local governments are taking measures to stimulate consumption. For example, Shanghai launched a shopping festival dubbed a Double Five Shopping Festival, which will run from May 5 to the end of June. It will feature more than 800 online and offline activities to bring convenience shopping experiences and benefits to consumers.
The problem is that the patterns the government plans to freeze are not the patterns we will need when they finally let us thaw. Things have changed, and many things will never go back to the way they were before. At Berkeley University in the United States, there is a think tank exploring how to unfreeze economies after COVID-19 put economic activity on ice. There, the discussion about the industries that thrived and received a COVID windfall during the crisis. When the government decides to pull the economy out of hibernation, the world will look very different. As a simple example, it's quite possible that many Australians forced to stay at home rather than eat out discover they love to cook. This will influence the demand for restaurants at the end of the crisis. On the other hand, our pent-up desire for active social lives might get us out into the hospitality sector with some enthusiasm. There will be drastic changes because of global supply chain disruptions and government policies. These changes will be exacerbated by the fact that not all countries will be unfrozen at the same time.
Now, joining us on the line is Colin Coleman. He's a South African banker who went and joined Yale University abroad. Now, we've been in the United States with Professor Stiglitz. We discussed a bit about China and a bit about Australia. Now, Colin, I wonder if you heard a bit about what Professor Stiglitz said, but he says basically, over and above the stimulus packages that were announced by governments across the world, the governments are also going to need to invest massively in recovery strategies. Do you think that will be the case in South Africa?
Thanks very much. Essentially, I think South Africa is going to require a three-phase strategy. Firstly, a stabilization strategy, which includes the 500 billion rand fiscal stimulus. Secondly, a modernization strategy implementing the structural reforms we've been talking about throughout President Ramaphosa's term. And thirdly, we're going to have to restructure the economy, which will involve addressing inequality, driving a significant public health investment, infrastructure investment, technology investment, and right-sizing the public service wage bill, amongst others. And along that road, we will have to see what the Minister of Finance delivers in the form of the revised budget in June.
Now, Professor Stiglitz said, Colin, that the problem with the American stimulus package is that its design was such that the money went into the major banks, the big banks, as well as large corporations, and not enough to the vulnerable. Now, South Africa's package, as you pointed out, is 500 billion, and only 10% of that, or 10 billion of that, rather, 10 billion of that goes to relief for the poor and the households. Do you think that we're going to be sitting with the same problem that Professor Stiglitz has expressed with regards to the United States?
Well, it's a complex set of problems because business drives employment, and so you have to make sure that your businesses survive. And that's why the 200 billion guarantee loan scheme was put in place, to effectively save the small and medium-sized businesses. The larger businesses, I'm sure Professor Stiglitz would agree with this, must fund themselves in the form of shareholder equity to the extent they need to be saved. So you'll see rights issues and other forms of equity capital raising that will take place for those businesses. And then for the poor individuals and for the unemployed, the people who've been furloughed or let off in this crisis, and I expect that'll be 1 to 2 million South Africans, the unemployment relief and the grants are very vital in providing a poverty relief system here. It may be over time that these fiscal measures need to be revised because depending on how things develop, and we know that this crisis is extremely fluid throughout the world and also in South Africa. So in response, the government will have to be very reactive to the dynamics and the data that we see on the ground. Certainly, for example, food relief and food schemes look like they're very important, and you see the long queues for the SASSA grants and you see the long queues for the food lines. And it's very important that all of society, civil society, government, business, come to assist the poor. There's no doubt, just finally, that what is going to happen here is you'll see the middle class, effectively receive a very significant downdraft, and the lower middle classes will, a significant number of them lose significant income, and the poor will become very reliant on social grants, even more so than is the case today.
Now, let's talk about debt spirals. Now, in the webinar in New York, many people, there were 200 people that joined the webinar from all over the world. They were worried about debt spirals. We know that when a company fails, it's not just that company that fails, its suppliers fail. And when a company goes into liquidation, a whole lot of downstream industries could be adversely affected, really creating a domino effect of bankruptcies and liquidations. And there was a discussion of what kind of support can the governments of the world give to companies in distress. Have the stimulus packages sufficiently given nuanced and targeted support to industries that are vulnerable?
Well, the UK and the US have gone far in providing actual support for income for employed people, so effectively subsidizing companies paying wages. We just in South Africa don't have the fiscal depth to be able to go down that road. We started off in a technical recession pre-COVID, and obviously this 500 billion is 10% of our GDP. It's a very significant, some would think too large, a fiscal input for it to be sustained post-COVID by a period of growth, because that's what you need in order to pay the debt. But absolutely, these issues that you talk about really raise the question of, will the bank system in the end have to be recapitalized in a country like South Africa? Because if there are significant enough company and corporate failures, it'll affect the banking credit environment, and you'll see a spike in non-performing loans. And with it, the question is, will there be sufficient bank capital against the assets, or will the South African banks have to raise more capital? I think we're a long way away from that. But in the world, we haven't seen the shoe drop on this, and I think the story is yet to play out.
Now, in the package of programs and in the new policy matrix that may form in the attempt to thaw the economy post-COVID, we'll have to spend a lot of time thinking about job creation. Now, we started off pre-COVID with jobless growth and with an employment rate that is similar to an unemployment rates that America had, 25% and above, during the Great Depression. Now, we are going to have to think, like many other countries, very clearly about how to support those industries in our country that are labor absorptive and labor creators, so that we can solve this perennial problem of unemployment in our country. What do you think we can do to support those sectors in the economy that can drive future jobs?
Well, look, I mean, it's really, you've got to look to the sectors that are really big job creators. Unfortunately, many of those are the ones that are suffering most. The tourism industry, the entertainment, restaurant trade, informal sector, these are areas that are being absolutely annihilated in this current lockdown. So, certainly in a post-lockdown environment when the economy reopens, there's going to have to be a lot of thinking about how to support those sectors, also the construction and infrastructure sector. And we're going to have to be very thoughtful about how to, as I say, create productivity instead of consumption, because productivity and investment is what is going to lead to growth, and the long-term growth is a precondition for jobs. So there's a separate question about what kind of growth do we need and what is the job-inducing growth that will come here. But technology is certainly going to be a very big winner in this COVID crisis, and technology is not necessarily pro-jobs. There are going to be some areas where jobs like data centers and so on will be job creating, but there'll be other areas where robotics and various forms of technology will replace jobs, and people get diseases robots don't. So I heard that very much on a Yale call I was on today, including with Jeff Immelt from GE. And these issues are going to be very big issues in a post-COVID environment.
So spare a thought for the South Africans in their great numbers who've been forming huge queues outside the UIF offices. If they are not going to be protected by future policies, and they are going to cede the non-jobs in this economy to robots. But let's talk about a new tax regime for South Africa. In the Berkeley webinar that we joined as the team, the economics team here at the SABC, to listen in to what the economics lecturers there are saying about a future post-COVID economy and how to open up an economy. They said that those companies like Amazon and the others that received a COVID windfall, that did obscenely well during COVID, should be taxed, and that money should be creamed off or top sliced and be given to those companies that really battled during COVID. What's your view?
But globally, this is a theme. The Financial Times has called for a basic universal income grant. Many people are talking about the fact that the taxation regime holistically is going to have to be reviewed across countries. I think it's a foregone conclusion that the United States is going to have to increase corporate tax. But remember, they have dropped their corporate tax rate significantly in the last decade or two. And so South Africa, which has a corporate tax rate of 28%, and we have our VAT, which we increased, and so on and so forth, has less room to play with in terms of increasing taxes, because your ability to digest in an economy higher taxes has a limit. So we are starting, unfortunately, at a point where the tax regime is already, some would argue, tapped out. You could play with it here or there, but there's not a lot of room. I think what the reality is, we're going to have to look at our resources, our GDP, and our revenue as a percentage of GDP, and try to grow that. But at the same time, we're going to have to spend what we have with more bang than we are. So our education and health systems, our policing systems, and so on and so forth, we're going to have much more impact with the money we invest. And we're going to have to get much more, investment into the economy through things like industrial incentives and playing to our strengths, such as the Africa Free Trade Agreement and area, and trying to position South Africa as an industrial manufacturer and exporter of goods and services into the continent.
Yes, thank you, Colin. That's all we have room for today. Thanks for joining us. That was very fascinating. Pleasure. Thank you. Pleasure. And now we take a small break. The National Small Business Chamber says moving most parts of the country to level 3 is too little, too late. In his address to the nation yesterday, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced a move from level 4 to level 3 at the end of May, with some exceptions, of course. Now, the Chamber says that Cape Town and Johannesburg, which have the biggest and the highest numbers of COVID-19 cases, are dominant areas for small businesses. CEO Mike Anderson said even at level 3, 75% of small businesses would still be enormously restricted. He said the threat to small businesses and livelihoods because of job losses in the sector was far greater than the threat to lives as a result of anything else. Now, on the line, we are joined by Dr. Roland Ngam. He's the Program Manager for Climate Justice and Socio-Economic Transformation at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. Hello, Roland. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, good evening. Glad to be here.
Now, a number of economists are saying that we are going to need a slew of economic policies and programs to ensure that the scarring on the economy and the devastation is not permanent, and that, in fact, our economy can bounce back pretty swiftly from the COVID-19 effects. What do you think should be in that mix of policies?
Yeah, first things first, I would just like to say that it is a pity that some people are pushing the economy to open up completely, forgetting that we have really high rate of HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis and diabetes and so on. And so it is important to protect the populations. Second thing, a quick bounce back is not really possible, because if you remember the other day, the Minister of Labor already announced that a number of companies have called him for large-scale retrenchment. And so a U-shaped recovery, unfortunately, is not on the cards. Now, in terms of policies, what the president has announced is that there will be shovel-ready projects. And I think that it is important at this stage, instead of austerity, what we need is Keynesian policies that will help to restart the economy. And this is an opportunity to go green and really big, because if you have noticed, Southern Africa in general is really water stressed. And we have had cases of hunger, not just and vulnerability, not just in South Africa, but also in Namibia and Zimbabwe and Zambia. And this is an opportunity to go green and adopt policies that will really shape South Africa for the next century.
And in terms of job creation policies, what do you think we should be doing? What direction should we take?
In terms of job creation policies, we really need major public works programs, programs that can, as you have seen, there is a serious problem of poverty. And so what we need is public works programs that will obviously help the people who live in townships, who live in rural areas, who do not have an income. The 350 Rand proposal is not enough. And so we need people who can, and projects to get people to build roads and bridges. And incidentally, you also heard the president during his last State of the Nation address talk about building a new city. These are opportunities to start building roads and preparing that city. In terms of such projects, we could employ in excess of 1 million people and help to give an income which will also stimulate the economy.
Now, the interview that we had earlier on with Colin Coleman addressed the issue of robots taking people's jobs, and the previous webinar addressed the issue of after the Second World War, America decided to give its central bank the mandate of full employment. Do you think that we need to look at the issue of full employment in the light of the fact that one of the effects of COVID will be the further blighting of jobs?
Well, you know that the fourth industrial revolution is already happening. Automation is a reality, and automation will take a lot of jobs. What we are seeing now as well is that companies are going into voluntary administration, and the reason why they are doing that is because when the economy fully reopens, many of the jobs that are lost are going to be replaced by machines. Machines are already, as we speak, being prepared to take over all of that. And so in terms of the future, we really need to move away from GDP growth and focusing too much on GDP growth. We have to move toward a kind of degrowth situation. And in a degrowth scenario, why not invest more heavily in some of the programs that will help people take better care of themselves? For example, the One Farmer, One Hectare program. The One Farmer, One Hectare program could be used to set up in excess of a million people and who will be empowered to take care of themselves as well as supply the supermarkets and restaurants around them. And so we really need to be thinking in these terms: degrowth, empowerment of the poor, recovery in the rural economies, and that is what will help stimulate the economy quickly. It is not the bailouts of the large multinationals that is going to save this country. It is heavy investments in the poor, in the rural areas, in sectors like agriculture, for example, in sectors like public works, for example.
Now, finally, the country has been set back a lot in terms of its development goals and in terms of achieving some of the UN development goals set out for many developing countries like us. What do you think we can do to catch up?
In terms of the development goals, obviously, I will disagree a bit. I believe that in terms of water supply, for example, a lot has been done. The Ministry of Water Affairs has done a lot to supply water because washing of hands was very important. That said, like I said earlier, we have to move away from focusing on multinationals and focus instead on the townships, the rural areas, and heavy investment in those areas will help them recover. Statistics South Africa has already showed in the 2019 household survey that about 53% of the country is vulnerable. And so we have to focus more in those areas, support them with public works programs, agricultural programs, rural electricity, and here ESCOM has to play a very big role, electricity supply. And by so doing, we will have a situation where there is degrowth, but where people are able to better take care of themselves.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ngam. That's where we have to leave it for tonight. The UN's flagship economic report found that the world economy is projected to shrink sharply by 3.2% this year due to the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic and exacerbating poverty and inequality. The World Economic Situation Prospects report estimates that the global economy will lose nearly $8.5 trillion in output over the next 2 years, wiping out nearly all the gains of the previous 4 years, causing an estimated 34 million people to fall below the extreme poverty line in 2020, with 56% of this increase occurring in African countries. Now, the U.S. correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Peace, that's the U.S. correspondent for the SABC, he spoke via Zoom to the UN's chief economist and began by asking him what the implications were of the report's dire projections.
I think we are facing a fundamental structural shift in the way our global economy works. For one thing, we have seen the degree of interconnectedness and how rapidly we are infected, if you will, by problems that are going on in any one place through the trade channels. And we've always known that we stand strong or fall apart together, but we were, I think, somewhat surprised at how rapidly these shocks were transmitted across countries. We've also seen, I think, how interconnected individual sectors are, that to the extent that we have a problem in the economy of a developed country, that the change in their demand structures can immediately have an impact on the tourism sector in a small island developing state on the other end of the world. And I think that has driven home more than any other factor in the last 30 years, the degree to which we all depend upon each other. Now, we've also seen as well that this crisis, although it affects us all differently. Mm. And there are many of us, for example, you and I, we're sitting here conducting our normal work online, but there are hundreds of millions of other people who cannot earn a wage unless they go out and execute their activities in close proximity to others, which means they're much more exposed to the damage of the crisis. And they may not be able to earn a living because their clients are not there because of the shutdown, the economic restrictions. And what that underscores more than, I think, any other phenomenon in the last 30 years is how deeply unequal our societies actually are. And we face a real problem, I think, even after the recovery starts, that some will have fallen even further behind, some countries, and even more important, some groups of people within countries. And we need to be sure in crafting our recovery approaches that we keep that in mind, that we try
Let's talk a bit about that. Let me jump in here. The pandemic will likely cause, according to this report, an estimated 34.3 million people to fall below the extreme poverty line in this year alone, 56% of this increase occurring in African countries. An additional 130 million people may join the ranks of people living in extreme poverty by 2030. Is this pandemic an existential threat to the UN's development agenda, particularly the SDGs?
It is a threat. Whether it's an existential threat depends on the nature of the recovery. As the Secretary General pointed out from the very beginning, it's also an opportunity. We had been lagging behind with regard to some of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have an opportunity now to direct our recovery in ways that allow us to catch up lost ground. Yeah? Now, for example, we know that some of the measures that have been put in place, the emergency measures, have dealt with providing social protection to workers who have been directly affected by the crisis. That is a resilience building measure, and we consider that that would be something that governments should build into the very fabric of their societies as a permanent fixture of their policy frameworks. This means that their societies have a greater degree of resilience going forward, are less subject to shocks in the future, and consequently less likely to fall off the pathway towards sustainable development should something untoward happen in the future. But by the same token, we understand that this is an opportunity as well to shape a more green and more sustainable type of economy. We have a lot of people who've lost jobs because of this crisis. We can direct our investments towards sustainable projects that might create what we call in the UN green jobs, decent work that can then provide a sustainable livelihood for people going forward.
Thanks for joining us tonight as we discussed how to thaw an economy and how to recover from the lockdowns. Thanks for joining us tonight. Good night.